Close your eyes and picture this fog rolling through the valleys of the Carpathian Basin, the faint echo of iron striking iron in the distance, and beneath that mist, the ghosts of a kingdom almost lost to memory. Tonight, we journey deep into the heart of a forgotten world, the land of the Gepids, a people once feared, then erased, their story buried beneath centuries of silence. They were neither as mighty as the Goths, nor as enduring as the Franks. Yet for nearly a century, they carved their name into the veins of Europe. Their kingdom rose from the wreckage of Rome, glittering for a moment like a shard of sunlight through storm clouds before vanishing. Sit back, relax, and let the whispers of time unfold. Some historians say the Gepids came from the mists of Scandinavia, part of the same restless migrations that birthed the Goths. Others believe they were older still descendants of tribes that lingered before even Rome had learned to dream. Their earliest memory is not written, but carried in bones and soil, in burials where warriors sleep with swords still clenched in skeletal hands. The world they knew was one of shifting alliances, endless wars, and cold rivers that marked the edge of known civilization. Imagine their ships cutting through icy waters, silent except for the wind that pressed against the wood, guiding them toward destiny. The Gepids were wanderers, then followers of fate, drifting through centuries until they found a land worth claiming. But in history's great theatre, every rise is only the beginning of a fall. The chronicles of the Goths mention them only in passing, shadowed figures trailing behind the greater tribes. But archaeology tells another story. Settlements, graves, weaponry, traces of a people learning to build, to rule, to adapt. They would soon emerge from obscurity, no longer wanderers, but rulers of a realm of their own. As the ancient north gave way to the restless south, as empires crumbled and the world grew dark, the Gepids stepped into history's light. Yet even then, destiny was already watching from the horizon. Who were these people, really ghosts in the Germanic tide or architects of something grander? The answer, hidden beneath centuries of soil and silence, still waits to be unearthed. The journey of the Gepids begins in the frozen north, in lands where winter never truly ends, and where the sea moans like an ancient creature in pain. It is said they left the shores of Scandinavia, sailing in small wooden ships carved with snarling beasts and painted with the smoke of pine tar. Some say they followed omens in the stars. Others suggest hunger and ambition drove them southward, chasing the promise of fertile land and forgotten gold. Whatever the reason, their voyage stretched across centuries, through forests that swallowed sunlight and rivers that bled into the heart of Europe. Imagine the sound, the creak of timbers, the rhythmic crash of waves, the guttural chants of men calling to their gods for safe passage. When they finally reached the Danubian plains, the world was changing. Rome's shadow was fading, and chaos had begun to take its place. The Gepids arrived not as conquerors, but as survivors, carving out a life between the collapsing walls of empires. Archaeologists have found traces of their passage graves filled with weapons that were both crude and masterful, ornaments forged with care, and runes that hint at the earliest echoes of their name. Here, among rivers like the Tisa and the Moros, they began to build more than settlements. They built memory. Over time, their warriors learned to ride like the Huns and trade like the Romans. Their kings wore both furs and silk, spoke of vengeance and diplomacy in the same breath. To their enemies, they were barbarians. To their allies, a necessary force between East and West, the land of Dacia modern day. Romania would become their sanctuary and their crucible. The soil was rich, the mountains formidable, and the rivers pulsed like veins feeding an awakening kingdom. The Gepids adapted, absorbing fragments of every culture they touched, until their identity was no longer purely northern. It was something entirely new, something born from the collision of worlds. Yet in the stillness of night, around their fires, they still whispered the names of the gods of their ancestors, their voices carried by the wind that once guided them from the sea. They were becoming a kingdom, but fate was not done testing them. For across the plains, a new power was rising, one that would either forge them into legend or crush them into dust. When the Huns thundered into Europe, the world of the Gepids trembled. Out of the eastern steppe they came, riding black horses with faces half hidden beneath leather and iron, their arrows darkening the sky. To some, they were the wrath of forgotten gods. To others, merely the next storm in an age of endless storms. The Gepids, caught between survival and annihilation, faced a choice that would shape their destiny: to fight the tide or to ride it. Under the iron rule of Attila, the Huns forged a vast confederation of peoples, and among them the Gepids became both servants and survivors. They marched in Hun armies, fought in Hun wars, and watched their kings bow before the scourge of God. But in their silence, they waited. Archaeological evidence from this time tells a story of duality: graves that blend nomadic and Germanic customs, weapons bearing both Hun ferocity and Gothic craftsmanship. Their culture absorbed the chaos of the steppe, yet refused to lose its core. Imagine the fear that ruled those years, the earth trembling beneath hooves, the smoke of burned villages painting the horizon red, and the sound of distant horns echoing through the valleys. The Gepids learned the ways of domination and obedience, the cruel lessons of empire built on terror. Yet in the heart of that servitude, they gathered strength. Their chieftain, Ardaric, watched and waited, a loyal ally by appearance, but a strategist in secret. Attila's empire was vast, but it was also brittle, held together by fear, not faith. And when the scourge of God finally died, the world exhaled, and the chains of his dominion cracked. The Gepids were ready. They had learned from the master of war himself, and now they would turn that knowledge upon his heirs. As the steppe lords divided his spoils, Ardaric called his warriors to arms. Spears glinted under the grey sky, and for the first time in generations, the Gepids prepared to fight not for survival, but for freedom. Some said they had become as ruthless as the Huns themselves, shaped by the very cruelty they had endured. Others whispered that vengeance had kept their hearts beating through the long years of submission. Either way, the storm they would unleash next would change the fate of Europe forever. The year was 454 AD, and the world trembled with uncertainty. The death of Attila had left his empire fractured, his sons squabbling over the corpse of a dominion that once stretched from the Volga to the Rhine. The air was heavy with the scent of rebellion, and from that chaos the voice of Ardaric rose. The Gepid king, once Attila's most trusted ally, gathered the broken tribes, the Goths, the Rugians, the Horali, and others who had suffered under Hun rule. They met upon the plains near the river Nadau, where grass bent under the weight of thousands of hooves, and the wind carried the whispers of vengeance. History remembers it as the day the oppressed turned upon their oppressors. As dawn broke, the mist clung to the earth, veiling the armies in ghostly silence. Then came the cry, a roar that shattered the stillness and unleashed the fury of years of servitude. The clash was brutal, savage, and unrelenting. Ardaric, leading from the front, fought with a calm fury, his golden helm glinting amid the chaos. The Huns, once unstoppable, found themselves encircled, their tactics mirrored and turned against them. The Gepids fought not as mercenaries this time, but as a nation reborn. Swords rang, arrows fell like rain, and the plains became a sea of motion and blood. When the battle ended, silence returned, but it was not peace. The Hunnic power was shattered, their empire broken into dust and legend. The Gepids stood victorious, drenched in the blood of their former masters, their banners rising against the grey horizon. It was said that Arderic wept after the battle, not for sorrow but for the terrible price of freedom. Thousands of his own lay dead beside their enemies, and the land itself seemed to groan under the weight of the fallen. Yet, from that carnage, a new kingdom was born. The Gepids claimed the lands of the Pannonian Basin, rich in rivers and fertile plains. The world had turned. No longer the servants of a nomadic empire, they were now the rulers of their own destiny. But freedom, as history often teaches, is never permanent. Even as they built their new home upon the ruins of the Huns, shadows from the east and west watched, waiting for their time to strike again. In the quiet after the storm of Nidau, the Gepids began to shape a kingdom from the ashes of conquest. They settled in the heart of the Carpathian Basin, a land of vast rivers, rolling meadows, and hidden valleys where the soil was dark and rich. Here they built their homes not as wanderers but as rulers. Wooden halls rose beside the banks of the Tisa River, and trade routes, once guarded by the Huns, now carried goods and whispers of power. Their capital, though lost to time, is believed to have stood somewhere near modern-day Sirmium, ancient Roman city that gleamed with crumbling marble and silent grandeur. The Gepids inherited much from Rome's ghostly ruins. They adopted its tools, its architecture, even fragments of its language. But they were no imitators. They fused Roman precision with Germanic pride, creating a culture both noble and fierce. Their warriors still bore the long spears of their ancestors, yet their leaders wore Roman-style cloaks fastened with jeweled brooches, symbols of a kingdom that balanced between past and future. Arderic's descendants ruled with a weight of both victory and fear, aware that the world beyond their borders was shifting once more. The Ostrogoths pressed from the west, ambitious and strong, while the rising Eastern Roman Empire watched with wary eyes. But within their borders, life pulsed with new rhythm. Fields yielded wheat and barley, traders crossed wooden bridges bearing silver and silk, and craftsmen carved intricate designs into bone and amber. Still, the old songs remained, the tales of the Huns, the cries of Nidau, the oaths sworn in blood. At night, fires flickered across the plains, and elders would remind the young that the Gepids were forged from servitude, born from rebellion, and bound to vigilance. Yet, beneath the calm surface, pride began to bloom, dangerous, intoxicating pride. The Gepids saw themselves not as survivors anymore, but as rightful heirs to the lands once ruled by the Huns. Their kings began to speak in the language of dominion, not gratitude. The iron of the steppe still flowed in their blood, and soon they would learn that the higher a kingdom rises, the deeper its fall can be. For beyond their fertile lands, new powers were stirring, powers that remembered both their defiance and their growing arrogance, as generations passed. The kingdom of the Gepids grew prosperous, their pride swelling like the rivers that nourished their plains. They had risen from servitude to sovereignty, from shadows to sunlight, and now their kings sat upon thrones draped in Roman silk. The memory of the Huns had become legend, a tale for fireside storytellers, not a warning for rulers. Their warriors wore ornate belts inlaid with gold. Their nobles drank from jeweled cups. and their women adorned themselves with brooches carved from amber and sapphire. Wealth flowed through their halls, and so too did ambition. The Gepid kings began to see themselves as the inheritors of empire, destined to dominate the Danubian world. But pride is a quiet poison, and history shows no mercy to those who forget the lessons of struggle. As the 5th century gave way to the 6th, the balance of power in Europe shifted once again. The Ostrogoths, under Theodoric the Great, rose to prominence in Italy, building an empire that rivaled Rome itself in glory. To the east, Constantinople gleamed its emperors, weaving diplomacy and deceit with equal skill. The Gepids, caught between these giants, walked a perilous path. They fought skirmishes with the Ostrogoths, sometimes winning, often losing, but never learning. When Theodoric died, they sensed weakness and struck, capturing the prized city of Sirmium. For a moment, it seemed the Gepid star was rising once more, but power never comes without eyes watching from the dark. The Lombards to the west saw their growing strength with envy, while the Byzantines to the south saw an opportunity to manipulate one barbarian against another. The stage was set for treachery, for alliances forged in shadows and broken in daylight. Within their courts, factions whispered. Old warriors muttered that the Gepids had forgotten the humility that once kept them alive. Yet the kings ignored such warnings. They believed themselves untouchable, blessed by fate, chosen by the gods of conquest. Gold replaced grit, and celebration replaced caution. And so, as they basked in their newfound splendor, the first cracks began to appear in the foundation of their kingdom. The echoes of their ancestors' struggle grew faint, drowned by music, laughter, and arrogance. But far beyond the borders of their lands, a storm was gathering once again, one that would remind the Gepids that history always remembers the proud, but rarely the fallen. The 6th century dawned with tension hanging over the Danubian plains like a gathering storm. The Gepids stood proud in their hard-won kingdom, but the world around them was shifting faster than their kings could see. To the west, the Lombards were rising a fierce, ambitious people hardened by war and driven by hunger for land. To the east, the Byzantine Empire watched with calculating eyes, its emperors spinning webs of diplomacy and betrayal to keep the barbarian tribes divided. Between these two powers, the Gepids stood like a boulder in a torrent, strong but slowly eroding under the pressure of time. Their cities gleamed with wealth, their armies marched in glittering armor, yet beneath the surface, discontent stirred. The nobles fought among themselves for power, old alliances crumbled, and whispers of betrayal spread through the smoky halls of their mead feasts. The Lombards, led by their cunning king, Ordoin, began probing the borders, testing the strength of the once mighty Gepid. Skirmishes flared like sparks across the plains, each one threatening to ignite into full war. The Gepid king, Thurisind, proud and aging, tried to hold his realm together with threats and promises, but the walls of his kingdom were closing in. The Byzantines, ever the masters of deceit, played both sides, offering gold to the Lombards, while sending envoys to the Gepids with honeyed words of friendship. Yet behind their smiles, they calculated how best to use one tribe to weaken the other. The mist of uncertainty thickened across the rivers and valleys. Traders reported Lombard scouts moving in the forests, and farmers vanished near the borderlands. The Gepid army mobilized, their long-haired warriors gathering beneath banners stitched with wolves and iron crosses. Each side claimed divine favor, each prayed for victory. And still the Byzantines watched, patient as ever, ready to step in when the blood had dried. It was a dangerous game being played on all fronts, and the Gepids were now at peace on a board they no longer controlled, even as their forges rang and their war songs echoed across the plains. Fate was already writing the next chapter of their story, a chapter of betrayal, battle, and the slow unraveling of a kingdom that had forgotten how fragile victory truly is. The first true clash between the Gepids and the Lombards came like thunder after years of distant rumbling. It began with border raids and the burning of villages, but soon turned into a full war that would decide the fate of both nations. King Thurasund led his warriors into the field, a proud old king clinging to the last breath of his people's independence. His army, forged from the strength of generations, was fierce and disciplined, but the Lombards fought with a fire that came from desperation. They had the hunger of a people seeking a homeland, while the Gepids fought to defend one that was slipping from their grasp. The battlefields of the Carpathian Basin turned red with blood, and the rivers ran thick with ash and broken weapons. Chroniclers spoke of one duel above all, a tragic encounter between the sons of kings. Therisund's son Turasund met Ordwin's son Alboin in single combat, a clash that echoed across legend. Some say they fought beneath a burning sky, their swords flashing like lightning, until Alboin's blade struck true, ending the life of the Gepid prince. It was not just the death of a warrior, but the breaking of the old order. Thurasund wept for his son, yet could not stop the tide of history moving against him. The Byzantines, watching from afar, fanned the flames of war with their treacherous diplomacies, porting the Lombards when it suited them, and withdrawing aid from the Gepids when they most needed it. The final defeat was slow, inevitable, and bitter. The Lombards pushed deeper into Gepid lands, their banners rising where the wolves of Thurasund once flew. Villages emptied, temples burned, and the silence of loss crept over the plains. The ancient songs of the Gepids grew faint, replaced by the marching drums of their enemies. When peace was finally declared, it was not peace born of victory, but of exhaustion. The Gepids had lost their sons, their borders, and much of their pride. Yet even in defeat, something within them endured a flicker of the old strength, a refusal to vanish quietly. But history rarely spares those caught between greater powers, and the next storm was already gathering beyond the horizon, unseen but inevitable. In the aftermath of war, the Gepid kingdom stood bruised but unbroken, its lands scarred by conflict and its people uncertain of the future. Thurasund's death marked the passing of an era, and his successor, Cunimond, inherited not a throne of glory, but one of tension and decay. The Byzantine Empire, ever patient in its schemes, now tightened its grip over the region like a spider drawing its prey closer. Emperor Justinian's diplomats arrived, draped in silk and smiles, offering promises of peace and trade while concealing daggers behind their words. The Gepids, desperate to rebuild, accepted Byzantine coin and aid, but in doing so, they invited the empire into the heart of their politics. Spies moved through their courts, whispers of rebellion were seeded in the ears of nobles, and slowly the independence of the Gepid kings began to wither. In Constantinople, the emperor's advisors debated whether the Gepids should remain as allies or be swept away like dust from an old floor. Some argued they could serve as a buffer against the Avars and Slavs creeping into Europe, while others believed that their existence only prolonged instability. Meanwhile, the Lombards watched from the west, gathering strength under the leadership of Alboin, the same prince who had slain Therisund's son. He had not forgotten the old blood feud, nor the humiliation of his father's earlier defeats. The Byzantine web grew tighter still as envoys travelled secretly between Alboin and the imperial court, promising gold, land, and support if the Lombards would finish what they had begun. And so the stage was set for another war, one not born from vengeance alone, but from manipulation on a grand scale. The Gepids sensed danger, yet could not agree on a path forward. Their nobles squabbled over loyalties, some favoring the Byzantines, others advocating an alliance with their old enemies. The once proud kingdom that had stood as a bastion of Germanic power in the Carpathian Basin was now divided from within. In the shadow of Byzantine intrigue, even friendship became suspect and loyalty turned to fear. The drums of diplomacy beat softly, but beneath their rhythm echoed the distant sound of approaching war. A war that would decide whether the Gepids would rise again or vanish from history altogether, as the tension between the Gepids and the Lombards reached its breaking point. The Carpathian Basin once again prepared for war. King Cunimond, proud and unyielding, refused to bow to either the Byzantines or the rising Lombard threat. He sought to reforge his people's unity, to reclaim the strength that once made the Gepids the masters of Dacia, yet fate, as ever, was not kind. Alboin, now king of the Lombards, had grown into a formidable ruler, cunning, ruthless, and bound by destiny to destroy the house of Thurasant. With Byzantine gold in his coffers and Avar horsemen at his side, he prepared to strike the final blow. The Gepids stood alone, betrayed by the same empire they once served. In the spring of 567, the two nations met in a battle that would echo through legend and fear. It took place near the river Tisa, where the mist rose thick and pale, muffling the sound of approaching armies. The ground trembled as thousands of hooves struck the earth, and the cries of war pierced the air. Cunimond's warriors fought with desperate courage, their shields locking in grim defiance, their spears glinting in the grey light. But the alliance between the Lombards and the Avars was too strong, their numbers overwhelming. One by one, the Gepid lines broke beneath the weight of iron and fire. The final stand came at sunset, when Cunimond himself was surrounded by Lombard warriors. Refusing to flee, he fought until his sword shattered and his body was pierced by countless blades. Alboin, victorious and merciless, had his enemy's head taken as a trophy, a grim symbol of dominance. Later chronicles whispered that he had Cunimond's skull fashioned into a drinking cup, a gruesome reminder of vengeance fulfilled. The Gepid kingdom crumbled that day. Cities burned, their treasures looted, their people scattered or enslaved. The survivors fled into the mountains or were absorbed by neighboring tribes. The name of the Gepids, once spoken with reverence, now fell silent beneath the thunder of Avar, hooves, and Lombard conquest. In the halls of Constantinople, the emperor's advisors celebrated, believing the balance of power had been restored. But in truth, a light had gone out in Europa, proud people erased not by fate alone, but by the cold calculations of empires and the ambitions of kings. When the battle smoke cleared and the cries of the dying faded into the wind, the land of the Gepids lay still, a kingdom reduced to silence. Their cities, once vibrant with trade and laughter, stood hollow and broken, their walls blackened by fire and their streets scattered with the remnants of a proud people. The Lombards marched west, taking their victory and their vengeance with them, leaving behind a void that the Avars soon claimed as their own. For the first time in over a century, there was no Gepid king, no army, no court to carry the weight of their legacy. Yet destruction did not erase them completely. Fragments of the Gepid nation endured like embers hidden beneath ash. Some fled south into Byzantine lands, where they entered imperial service as mercenaries and guardsmen. Others were enslaved by the Avars, their bloodline merging into new tribes that rose from the ruins. A few found refuge among the local Romanized populations, blending into the mosaic of cultures that filled the Carpathian Basin. To the empires and chroniclers of the age, the Gepids became little more than a footnote, a name carved on the margins of old maps, a shadow swallowed by history. Yet beneath the soil, their story waited to be uncovered. Their burial sites, scattered across the plains and valleys, would one day reveal the truth of their lost world. Their ornaments of gold and garnet, their weapons and pottery, whispered of craftsmanship that rivaled their Gothic kin. Each discovery, centuries later, would tell a story of elegance, power, and tragedy. The Avars who took their place ruled harshly, but even they could not erase the lingering memory of the Gepid realm. Local legends persisted, speaking of the ghost kings who once ruled from the riverbanks, and of treasure buried deep beneath the old fortress mounds. In the monasteries of Byzantium, scribes wrote their names with fading ink, uncertain of when their story truly ended. The fall of the Gepids was more than the end of a nation. It was the vanishing of a culture that bridged the ancient and medieval worlds. Their silence became their final legacy, a reminder that even the strongest kingdoms can fade into echoes, leaving behind only fragments for future generations to find and wonder at in the dark. Centuries passed, and the fields where the Gepids once marched turned to quiet farmlands, their ruins swallowed by grass and time. Beneath the earth, however, their story slept buried in tombs lined with iron, gold, and the dust of forgotten kings. It was not until the spades of archaeologists broke the soil that their echoes began to speak again. In the valleys of Romania, Hungary, and Serbia, graveyards emerged like voices rising from the silence. Skeletons adorned with gilded buckles, jeweled brooches, and rings of Byzantine design told of a people who once stood at the crossroads of empires. Each discovery revealed layers of their vanished world. The weight of a sword balanced for battle, the pattern of a woven cloak, the delicate curve of an earring forged by hands that had long since turned to dust. From these remnants, the Gepids began to reappear not as mere barbarians in the shadows of Rome, but as artisans, traders, and rulers who shaped a world of their own. Scientists used isotope analysis to trace the diets of their warriors, discovering patterns of migration and wealth distribution across their territories. DNA studies began to whisper of connections between the ancient Gepids and modern populations still living along the Carpathian Basin, suggesting that their bloodlines, though scattered, had never truly vanished. Metallurgical examinations of their weapons revealed surprising sophistication, showing trade links stretching from the Balkans to the steppes of Central Asia. Even their jewelry carried stories, fragments of a cultural fusion between Germanic, Roman, and steppe traditions. The more that was unearthed, the clearer it became that the Gepids had not been a forgotten tribe at all, but one of the silent architects of post-Roman Europe. Their craftsmanship influenced neighboring cultures, their settlements shaped the flow of trade, and their brief kingdom left an imprint far greater than its years. Yet, as each new artifact was lifted from the soil, a question always lingered: what did these people think in their final moments as their world collapsed? Were they aware that their names would fade? Or did they believe, as all nations do, that their story would endure forever? The earth alone holds their answer, and it continues to whisper it softly to those who listen. Long after the last Gepid king had fallen, traces of their presence still lingered not in books or chronicles, but in the very landscape they once ruled. Across Romania, Hungary, and Serbia, place names whispered echoes of their tongue, faint but enduring. Linguists who studied the region began to notice peculiar patterns. Clusters of ancient toponyms that carried Germanic roots hidden beneath layers of Slavic and Latin evolution. A village name ending in Heim or Berg, a river whose old title meant swift, a valley whose word for iron traced back to Gothic canal, spoke quietly of a vanished people who had left their mark upon the earth. Yet distinguishing the specifically Gepid from the generally Germanic was a puzzle that scholars still wrestled with. The languages of the East Germanic tribes were too closely bound, their words too similar, and time had worn away the finer distinctions. Still, the persistence of these linguistic ghosts hinted at something profound, that the Gepid settlement was not a fleeting conquest, but a deep, rooted presence that shaped the speech and identity of those who came after. Even as the empire of Byzantium expanded and the Avars swept through the plains, the old words survived in the mouths of peasants who no longer remembered where they came from. Archaeologists traced these names to burial mounds, hill forts, and river crossings, finding patterns that matched the outlines of the lost Gepid kingdom. Each place name became a compass point, guiding researchers through centuries of obscurity toward a clearer understanding of who these people were and how far their influence reached. Language, after all, is memory, and, in those old syllables, the memory of the Gepids endured. To walk across those lands today is to walk upon their hidden map, where every hill, field, and waterway still hums with the faint vibration of their vanished world. The stones may have crumbled, but the words remain, etched into the geography like faint fingerprints of a forgotten civilization. And somewhere between myth and history, between silence and speech, the language of the Gepids still speaks not in the living voice of a nation, but in the quiet persistence of the earth itself, in the laboratories of modern Europe. Centuries after the fall of the Gepids, another kind of discovery began to unfold, not through shovels or ruins, but through strands of DNA. Scientists extracted genetic material from ancient bones unearthed in Carpathian cemeteries, their fragile remains still holding the code of a vanished nation. What they found blurred the line between past and present. Markers within the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA hinted at surprising continuity between the ancient Gepid population and modern communities living in Romania, Hungary, and northern Serbia. It was as though the blood of the long-lost kingdom had quietly persisted, diluted but never erased. The genetic signatures spoke of migration, intermarriage, and adaptation, threads of human life weaving endlessly through the tapestry of history. Yet questions lingered. Were these markers distinctly Gepid, or remnants of broader Germanic movements that swept through the continent? No one could say for certain. Still, the evidence suggested something powerful, that despite conquest, assimilation, and centuries of silence, a biological echo of the Gepids still flowed through the veins of people walking those lands today. The thought carries a strange kind of comfort that though the kingdom perished, its people did not vanish entirely. Their legacy lives on not just in artifacts or ruins, but in the living bodies of their descendants, unaware that within them sleeps the memory of iron and gold, of kings and warriors, of craftsmen and farmers who once stood at the crossroads of empires. The analysis of their bones revealed other secrets too. Isotope studies uncovered patterns of diet and migration. Some individuals had grown up locally, others had come from distant regions, suggesting a society both settled and mobile. Their women wore jewelry that reflected trade with Byzantium. Their warriors bore weapons influenced by both Gothic and steppe traditions. The DNA told of diversity, of a people who absorbed and adapted rather than isolated themselves. In the end, it was not just the bones that spoke, but the realization that history is not gonit, continues to breathe in those who inherit it unknowingly. Beneath the dust of forgotten graves lies the truth that no civilization ever truly disappears. It transforms, it hides, and sometimes it survives in the blood of those who never knew its name. The story of the Gepids does not end with their disappearance. It echoes through the chronicles of those who came after, shaping the evolution of kingdoms that would rise upon their ashes. In the eyes of modern historians, their brief but brilliant experiment in statecraft stands as a mirror reflecting the greater transformation of post-Roman Europe. The Gepids, like the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths before them, proved that the so-called barbarians were capable of creating structured, stable societies from the ruins of empire. Their rule over Dacia was not chaos but adaptation, delicate balance between Germanic tribal law and the lingering administrative systems of Rome. Within their courts, scribes copied decrees in Latin while chieftains ruled through ancient Germanic councils. Soldiers bore Roman-style armor beside traditional war axes, and taxes were levied in both gold and grain. Their government became a hybrid form, part tribal, part imperial, an early reflection of what medieval Europe would later become. Even their diplomacy displayed remarkable sophistication. The Gepids maintained embassies with Byzantium, negotiated alliances with the Goths, and signed treaties that revealed an understanding of international politics far beyond mere warfare. Some historians now argue that their kingdom served as a prototype for later European feudalism, where the fusion of Roman authority and Germanic loyalty would define the medieval world. Yet the same adaptability that gave them strength also sowed the seeds of their downfall. As they absorbed Roman customs, their warrior spirits softened. As they mimicked Byzantine politics, they inherited its intrigues and betrayals. The Gepids became a mirror not only of Europe's potential, but also of its fragility. Their story warns that civilization is never a solid structure. It is a fragile truce between power and decay. When that balance falters, even the proudest kingdoms can collapse in a generation. And yet, through that collapse, Europe was reborn. The administrative models the Gepids once used spread quietly through their neighbors, influencing the Lombards and later the Franks. Their concept of kingship, their hybrid laws, even their artistic designs became part of a shared European identity that endured long after their name faded from maps. In this way, the Gepids never truly vanished. They were absorbed into the bloodstream of civilization itself, forgotten by history, but not by time. As the 6th century drew to its close, the Gepid crown, once a symbol of unity and defiance, became little more than a relic lost to dust. Legends whispered that the final diadem of the Gepid kings was forged from fragments of Roman gold and Gothic steel, a crown heavy with the weight of 3 civilizations. It was said to gleam with the faint light of Dacia's moon, passed from king to king until the last battle erased its lineage forever. When the Avars swept through the Carpathian Basin, they brought annihilation, not conquest. Villages burned, monasteries crumbled, and the royal fortresses that once echoed with command fell into silence. Chroniclers of the Byzantines wrote of a people devoured by the storm, their bones whitening along the banks of the Tisa River. The crown itself vanished, perhaps melted down by Avar hands, perhaps buried beneath the ruins of or perhaps spirited away by a loyal retainer who refused to let his king's honor be defiled. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments of jewelry and twisted metal that could have belonged to royal regalia. but nothing definitive remains. The true power of the crown, however, was never in the gold. It was in the idea that a scattered tribe could rise to sovereignty through courage, cunning, and the will to rule their own destiny. When that crown disappeared, it symbolized more than the end of a kingdom. It marked the death of an era where tribes still believed they could stand independent in a world ruled by empires. The vacuum left by the Gepids was soon filled by the Lombards, who inherited both their lands and their lessons. Even as the Avars enslaved survivors, stories of the lost Gepid crown lingered, told in secret by those who remembered the time when Dacia had been theirs. The myth of the vanishing crown endured through centuries of retelling, a symbol of ambition and loss, pride and impermanence. In a sense, it was fitting that no one ever found it. For a people whose history straddled myth and reality, the disappearance of their crown was the final act of transformation, from a tangible nation into a haunting legend that time itself could not erase. Long after the Gepids themselves had vanished from written history, the earth kept their memory hidden beneath its surface. It was in the soft soils of Transylvania and along the rivers of Hungary that archaeologists first began unearthing traces of their world long gone, yet eerily preserved in silence. Burial mounds yielded skeletons adorned with twisted silver torques and bronze buckles, their bones arranged in careful symmetry, as though even in death the Gepids sought order. Many graves contained weapon swords, worn with use, spears broken in battle, shields with rusted bosses that still bore the faint pattern of a lion or serpent. Others revealed the tenderness of their domestic life, combs carved from bone, brooches shaped like crescent moons, fragments of pottery etched with the spirals of their forgotten language. The most haunting discoveries came from the royal necropolises near Szolnok and Apata tombs, so elaborate that they spoke of kings who tried to rival the grandeur of Byzantium. In one grave, a warrior lay encased in gold-threaded fabric, a sword resting across his chest, its hilt studded with garnets that still shimmered after 15 centuries. The scientists who studied him believed he had once commanded thousands, but his name, like his kingdom, had dissolved into the silence of time. What these bones revealed was not just a civilization, but a tension between barbarism and refinement of people, both fierce and graceful, both conquerors and craftsmen. Every artifact told a fragment of the story that the chronicles had ignored, and every unearthed skull whispered the same truth, that no empire, no tribe, no nation truly disappears, they simply sleep, waiting to be remembered. As modern excavators mapped their graves, they began to see patterns, clan divisions, social hierarchies, even trade connections that stretched deep into the Byzantine heartlands. The bones beneath the earth told of a society far more complex than the barbarian label assigned by Roman scribes. And yet, the more that was uncovered, the greater the mystery became. For every relic found, another question emerged. Where were their temples, their chronicles, their songs? Did they vanish, or were they buried too deeply for us to reach? The earth, it seems, remembers everything. It just chooses what to reveal and when. In the ruins of Sirmium, where cracked stones lie half buried beneath centuries of soil and silence, the whispers of the Gepids still echo between broken arches. Once a Roman jewel, this city had been the heart of their short-lived glory, a place where Gothic banners fluttered beside crumbling statues of emperors, and the scent of smoke and incense mixed in the air. When the Gepids claimed Sirmium, they inherited its ghosts, its forgotten gods, and its decaying magnificence. They rebuilt where they could, patched marble with timber, and made the city breathe again, if only for a fleeting moment in history. But now, when the wind passes through the ancient stones, it seems to carry the sound of footsteps, warriors marching to their final stand, the cries of citizens who once believed in a kingdom that would last. Archaeologists who have walked those ruins speak of the strange stillness that lingers there, as though the city refuses to let go of the souls that once guarded it. Beneath the cracked foundations lie layers of history, the Roman, the Gothic, the Gepidal, woven together in a tapestry of conquest and collapse. Fragments of amphory iron keys, coins stamped with faint symbols of forgotten kings, and shards of painted glass, all that remains of an age that flickered briefly before being consumed by the storms of migration. Some say the Gepids cursed Sirmium when they lost it to the Avars, binding their fate to its stones. Others believe that the city itself devoured them, as it had devoured so many before. There are stories of strange lights at night, of whispers rising from beneath the earth, as if the ground itself remembers the final massacre. For historians, Sirmium is a puzzle of ashes and echoes. But for those who stand there at dusk, when the air turns heavy and gold, it feels like a place where time itself faltered, a place haunted not by ghosts of people, but by the ghost of a civilization that refused to be forgotten. Each ruin, each weathered stone, stands as a reminder that empires are fragile things, that the line between glory and oblivion is thinner than a breath, and that somewhere beneath the dust of the Gepids are still waiting to be remembered. No one knows how the Gepid tongue truly sounded. There are no preserved inscriptions, no songs, no prayers, no records carved into stone. Only fragments of Gothic words borrowed by neighboring tribes, faint echoes passed down like broken glass. Linguists have tried to reconstruct their speech through comparison, tracing faint patterns within the Gothic, Lombardic, and Old High German dialects. Some believe the Gepid language shared the harsh consonants and deep vowels of the East Germanic branch, perhaps softer, perhaps slower, shaped by centuries in the Carpathian air. Others imagine it was a tongue of rhythm and resonance, designed for the chanting of names and oaths rather than poetry. But the truth is lost, swallowed by time. When the last Gepid child spoke his mother's words to a foreign ear, that sound became a ghost, a language without listeners. Every civilization is built upon its voice, and when that voice fades, its identity follows. The Romans had their Latin, the Byzantines their Greek, the Goths their scripture, but the Gepids left behind only silence. Perhaps they never had the chance to write, their words confined to memory and speech, scattered when their people were enslaved or absorbed into others. It is strange to think that an entire language, once capable of expressing love, command, fear, and faith, could vanish without a single sentence surviving. Yet this, too, is part of their tragedy. For all their gold, their kings, their battles, and their courage, they could not preserve their voice. Some scholars suspect faint traces may linger in local dialects of Transylvania, hidden within place names or the rhythm of rural speech. A few mountain villages still carry names that sound older than any recorded tongue, syllables that seem carved from another world. Could these be remnants of the Gepid lexicon, reshaped by centuries of foreign rulers? Perhaps, or perhaps they are only coincidences, illusions of history. But the idea itself is haunting that somewhere, deep in the mountains or valleys where the Gepids once lived. A farmer still mutters a word that belonged to them, unaware that it is a fragment of a vanished world. A civilization ends not when its cities fall, but when its language no longer lives in the human throat, though the Gepids disappeared from the chronicles. Their blood never vanished, simply blended like ink poured into water, diffusing quietly through the veins of Europe. After their kingdom fell, the survivors scattered among the tribes that surrounded them. Some were absorbed by the Lombards, others enslaved by the Avars, and many melted into the Slavic populations rising across the Balkans and Carpathians. In time, their identity faded, but their lineage endured. Modern DNA studies, conducted in Hungary and Romania, have revealed traces of East Germanic ancestry that align with Gepid burial sites. In the skeletal remains excavated near Szolnok and Transylvania, researchers found genetic signatures distinct from both local populations and Gothic migrants, an echo of a forgotten people. These fragments of identity tell us that history's silence does not erase blood. It only conceals it beneath centuries of intermingling. The descendants of the Gepids may walk among us even now, unaware that their ancestors once stood shoulder to shoulder with the kings of the Huns, the Goths, and the Romans. It is a strange thought that ordinary people living simple lives may unknowingly carry within them the story of a vanished civilization. Perhaps a child in modern-day Romania or Hungary carries the same DNA that pulsed through the veins of a Gepid warrior who fought at Nadao, or a queen who once walked the marbled halls of Sirmium. The blood remembers what the mind forgets. And though the Gepids left no monuments to mark their passing, their presence lingers in bone, in chromosome, in the unseen architecture of life itself. Scientists can measure it, now percentages and sequences, strands that whisper of migrations and unions long forgotten. But what they cannot measure is the spirit behind it, the courage, the loss, the desire to belong to something greater than the self. That is what the Gepids gave to Europe, even in disappearance, the quiet endurance of a people who refused to be erased completely. Their legacy does not live in empires or language, but in the living tapestry of humanity itself, woven invisibly through the centuries. Every face, every family, every hidden ancestry reminds us that no civilization ever truly vanishes. It only changes its form, waiting for time to remember its name. Beneath the soil of the Carpathian Basin, the silence of the Gepids still speaks. Every spate of dirt lifted by an archaeologist's hand reveals whispers from a world that has not drawn breath for more than 1,000 years. In the still air of burial chambers, gold glints faintly in the lamplight fibulae, shaped with intricate spirals, swords inlaid with patterns that merge Roman precision with Germanic ferocity. Each artifact seems to hum faintly, as though it remembers the hand that forged it, the ritual that blessed it, the voice that sang above it. Modern technology has become the new seer of this buried world. Through isotopic analysis, researchers can trace where a Gepid warrior was born, where he traveled, what kind of food he ate, and perhaps even the landscape he once called home. Through carbon dating, their cities are mapped. Through metallurgical study, their trade routes stretch out like veins through Europe. And from the ancient cemeteries near Szolnok, Apahida, and Sirmium, a clearer image of the Gepids emerges, not a people of savagery and plunder as early chroniclers once claimed, but a civilization of artisans, traders, and rulers who built a society of subtle grace amid chaos. DNA extracted from their bones links them to populations in northern Europe, confirming their Germanic roots, yet also to local lineages, showing their ability to blend and adapt. It is as if the earth itself had hidden away their story, protecting it until the world was ready to understand it without prejudice. When scientists peer through microscopes or analyze data streams on their glowing screens, They are unknowingly resurrecting the voices of those who believed they had been erased. The clang of their forges, the chant of their rituals, the cries of their battles all return, faint but clear, through the hum of machines. The Gepids left no written history, no scrolls or chronicles, yet their bones have become their final manuscript. Each discovery writes another line, each excavation turns another page, and as the dust clears from an unearthed helmet or brooch, one cannot help but feel a haunting certainty: the dead do not sleep in silence. They wait, patient, beneath centuries, for us to listen. As the 6th century drew to its close, the twilight of the Gepids deepened into silence. Their final king, Cunimund, fell beneath the sword of the Lombard king Alboin, his skull taken as a grisly trophy, transformed into a drinking cup that would echo through legend and horror alike. The Gepid capital, Sirmium, once a radiant city of stone and faith, was reduced to ashes and rubble. Survivors fled eastward, some seeking refuge within the Byzantine Empire, others vanishing into the ranks of the Lombards and Avars, their names slowly dissolving into the murk of time. The great banners of the Gepid kingdom were lowered forever, their language fading like smoke over the plains of the Danube, yet the traces of their existence refused to die. The stones of ruined churches whispered of forgotten prayers. The rings buried with their dead gleamed faintly, untouched by centuries of darkness. The pattern of their settlements still marks the map of southeastern Europe like faint scars of memory. Historians once dismissed them as a footnote, a minor tribe, crushed between mightier powers but modern. Eyes see something deeper. The Gepids represented one of the last experiments of the migration era, the attempt of a nomadic people to root themselves, to build order amid the ruins of empire. They forged law from fragments of Rome, faith from the fires of Arianism, and identity from the shifting soil of the Carpathian world. Though they were conquered, their example rippled outward, influencing kingdoms that rose after them, the Lombards, the Franks, even the Byzantines who absorbed their refugees. Their ghostly fingerprints lie upon medieval law, upon the art of statecraft, upon the very rhythm of European civilization. And so, when we speak of the fall of the Gepids, we are not recounting a disappearance, but a transformation. The kingdom died, but the people endured, their spirit diffused into the bloodstream of Europe. Their story is not one of failure, but of adaptation, the quiet persistence of a culture that refused to vanish even when history turned its face away. As you drift into sleep, imagine the last torchlight flickering along the Danube, the final song of the Gepids rising into the night, air soft, defiant, eternal.